Study section 11. Impact of European expansion. Introduction. Europeans' relations with other parts of the globe during the age of exploration had far-reaching consequences on world history. Thus, this study section presents how this phenomenon has transformed the political, economic, demographic, and socio-cultural landscape of world affairs. It is against this background that this study section set out to examine these consequences. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this section, you should be able to describe the impact of European expansion. Terminology. Subordination, belonging to a lower or inferior class or rank. Periphery, the external boundary of any surface or area. Political impact. Politically, nations in Europe set up empires overseas. Europeans also fought many wars trying to take colonized lands from one another, thus intensifying hatred, suspicion, and distrust among these countries. Many great civilizations in the Americas, Aztec, Incas, Maya, and so on, and Africa were destroyed. European principles of laws and systems of government were imposed on the subjugated peoples and conquered lands. Between 1492 and 1885, Europe's continental power and reach were unchallenged by any other area of the world. For Africa, she had to resist the bitter European occupation and dismemberment in the 19th and 20th centuries. The political domination of African and indeed other parts of the world that were dominated was to enable Europeans further exploit the resources of the Newfoundland and to protect their investments in these places. What were the political relations between the European mother countries and their colonies? The general picture is one of subordination to the political direction of the mother country. Even in the English colonies of North America and the West Indies, where representative institutions were set up. The best example of centralized control by the mother country is seen in the Spanish Empire, where the Council of the Indies sent from Spanish to the viceroys in Spanish American a never-ending stream of detailed orders on matters, great and small. Similar control from the center was exercised by France over her colonies. The control was accepted by the colonists, though discontent with, and even open criticisms of the situation began to grow with time. Two important factors, however, kept the colonies loyal. They depended on their mother countries for defense and for markets. It is also imperative to note that conventions, customs, and rules of international relations were also laid during this period. Economic impacts. We begin this section by noting that a major reason for the European overseas venture in the 15th century was the desire to improve the economic fortunes of the individuals and states that embarked on this venture. The exploitation of the resources of the areas they got to was twofold. First was the exploitation of the mineral and agricultural resources of the areas they got to, some of which were eventually colonized. Second was the exploitation of the human resources available in these areas. In this wise, the Africans and the Amerindians were worse hit. In the European quest to maximize the land resources of the areas they got to, they required cheap labor. For this reason, they embarked on trade in human beings, which lasted for over 3 centuries. The exploitation of human and material resources of the indigenous peoples led to inextricable nexus of this area as peripheries to the economy of the colonizing metropolitan powers. It is therefore apt to surmise that the disproportionate economic relationship between Europe and most of the eventually colonized areas was laid during this period. The exchange of products between European countries and their colonies changed economic relations around the world. European countries saw their colonies as a way to get rich. Countries in Europe became very rich, and companies were started for the purposes of trade. New products were brought to Europe. Banking grew across Europe as hundreds of tons of gold, silver, and other precious metals and minerals were taken out of the African, Asia, and the Americas to enrich Europe. Other items becoming important in global trade were the sugarcane and cotton crops of the Americans. Millions of Africans were uprooted during this time and sent across the ocean to the Americans and the Caribbeans, making Europeans who had plantations and businesses in those places rich and powerful. A new middle class of merchants and bankers gained power in Europe. The new transoceanic links and their domination by the European powers led to the age of imperialism, where European colonial power came to control most of the planet. The European appetite for trade, commodities, empire, and slaves greatly affected many other areas of the world. Spain participated in the destruction of aggressive empires in America, only to substitute for its own and forcibly replace the original religions. The new transoceanic links and their dominations by the European powers led to the age of imperialism, where European colonial powers came to control most of the planet. The European appetite for trade, commodities, empire, and slaves greatly affected many other areas of the world. Spain participated in the destruction of aggressive empires in America, only to substitute for its own and forcibly replace the original religions. The pattern of territorial aggressions was repeated by other European empires, most notably the Dutch, Russian, French, and British. In coastal Africa, local states supplied the appetite of European slave traders, changing the complexion of coastal African states and fundamentally altering the nature of African slavery, causing impact on societies and economics deep inland. The Atlantic slave trade developed after Europeans began exploring and establishing trading posts on the Atlantic west coast of Africa in the mid-15th century. The first major group of European traders in West Africa was the Portuguese, followed by the British and the French. In the 16th and 17th centuries, these European colonial powers began to pursue plantation agriculture in their expanding possessions in the New World, North, Central, and South American and the Caribbean islands, across the Atlantic Oceans. As European demand grew for products such as sugar, tobacco, rice, indigo, and cotton, and as more New World land became available for European use, the need for plantation labor increased. African states already involved in slave trading supplied the Europeans with African slaves for export across the Atlantic. Africans tended to live longer on the tropical plantations of the New World than did European laborers, who were susceptible to tropical diseases, and Native Americans, who were extremely susceptible to Old World diseases brought by the Europeans from Europe, Asia, and Africa. Also, enslaved men and women from Africa were inexpensive by European standards. Therefore, Africans became the major source and eventually the only source of New World plantation labor. The Africans who facilitated and benefited from the Atlantic slave trade were political or commercial elites, generally members of the ruling apparatus of African states or members of large trading families or institutions. African sellers captured slaves and brought them to markets on the coast. At these markets, Europeans and American buyers paid for the slaves with commodities including cloth, iron, firearms, liquor, and decorative items that were useful to the sellers. Slave sellers were mostly male, and they used their increased wealth to enhance their prestige and connect themselves through marriage to other wealthy families in their realms. The Africans who were enslaved were mostly prisoners of war or captives resulting from slave raids. As the demand for slaves grew, so did the practice of systematic slave raiding, which increased in scope and efficiency with the introduction of firearms to Africa in the 17th century. By the 18th century, most African slaves were acquired through slave raids, which penetrated farther and farther inland. Africans captured in raids were marched down well-worn paths, sometimes for several hundred miles, to markets on the coast. From the mid-15th to the late 19th century, European and African slave traders purchased approximately over 20 million slaves from West and West Central Africa. A small percentage of these slaves, particularly in the early years of the trade, were sent to Europe, especially to Spain and Portugal. Most, however, were shipped across the Atlantic for sale in Portuguese, administered Brazil, the British, French, Dutch, and Danish islands of the Caribbean, Spanish-controlled South and Central America, and the British North American mainland, later the United States and Canada. The Atlantic crossing, known as the Middle Passage, was nightmarish for slaves who were poorly fed, subject to abuses at the hand of the crew, and confined to cramped storage hold in which diseases spread easily. Historians estimate that between 1.5 and 2 million slaves died during the journey to the New World. Also, the structure of the economic relationship between Europe and other lands in which they exploit the raw materials from this area and provide them with finished goods also became entrenched. This raw material spans through agricultural products to mineral resources. This structure has continued to endure up to the present day. Sociocultural impacts, religion and language. Some of the most significant cultural changes Europeans effected in places they conquered were in religion and language. Christians set out to convert people to their religion. Missionaries went to Asia and Africa, and they also worked to convert American Indians to Christianity. In some places, their religion blended with native traditions to create new kind of religion practices. The Portuguese conquest opened the way for a great missionary effort by the Catholic Church in the East. The first Christian order to reach India were the Franciscans, who had established themselves at Goa and Cochin by 1520. The Dominicans and Jesuits followed. A notable example was St. Francis Xavier, the Apostle of the Indies, as he was called. In a number of Portuguese settlements in the East, the mixed population resulting from the intermarriage of Portuguese and Asians formed Christian communities which still exist. The point in emphasis is the fact that Christianity was brought to new lands and peoples. It must also be noted that as early as the 15th century, Christianity has been introduced into West Africa. Prominent among the places that missionary activities operated in was the ancient empire of Benin. In addition to spreading Christianity, missionaries ran schools. They taught their European language such as Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch, the language of the Netherlands. This also entailed the introduction of their knowledge system and its production processes and conveyance. It is this that is today's style Western education. Cultural exchanges. Indian merchants involved in spice trade took Indian cuisine to Southeast Asia, notable present-day Malaysia and Indonesia, where spice mixtures and curries became popular. European people intermarried with the Indians and popularized valuable culinary skills such as baking in India. The Portuguese also introduced vinegar to India, and Franciscan priests manufactured it from coconut toddy. European forms of dressing, architecture, food, and so on were also transferred to other parts of the globe. After Columbus' arrival in the Americas, the animal, plant, and bacterial life of this tool world began to mix. This process, first studied comprehensively by American historian Alfred Crosby, was called the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange had dramatic and lasting effect on the world. New diseases were introduced to Amerindian populations that had no prior experience of them. The results were devastating. This population also were introduced to new weeds and pests, livestock and pets. New food and fiber crops were introduced to Eurasia and Africa, improving diet and fomenting trade there. In addition, the Columbian Exchange vastly expanded the scope of production of some popular drugs, bringing the players and consequences of coffee, sugar, and tobacco use to millions of people around the globe. Introduction of diseases. Soon after 1492, sailors inadvertently introduced these diseases, including smallpox, measles, mumps, whooping cough, influenza, chickenpox, and typhus to the Americas. The Native Americans had no such immunities. Adults and children alike were stricken by wave after wave of epidemic, which produced catastrophic mortality throughout the Americas. In the largest center of island Mexico and Peru, millions of people died. On some Caribbean islands, the Native American population died out completely. In all, between 1492 and 1650, perhaps 90% of the first Americans had died. This loss is considered among the largest demographic disasters in human history. By stripping the Americans of much of the human population, the Columbian Exchange rocked the region's ecological and economic balance. Ecosystems were in tumult as forests regrew and previously hunted animals increased in number. Economically, the population decrease brought by the Columbian Exchange indirectly caused a drastic labor shortage throughout the Americas, which eventually contributed to the establishment of African slavery on a vast scale in the Americas. By 1650, the slave trade had brought new diseases such as malaria and yellow fever, which further plagued Native Americans. They also had another disease, probably a form of tuberculosis, that may or may not have been similar to the pulmonary tuberculosis common in the modern world. Native Americans also apparently suffered from a group of illnesses that included two forms of syphilis. One controversial theory asserts that the venereal syphilis epidemic that swept much of Europe beginning in 1494 came from the Americas. However, the available evidence remains inconclusive. Introduction of crops and animals. The sweet potato, which was introduced into China in the 1560s, became China's third most important crop after rice and wheat. It proved a useful supplement to diets throughout the monsoon lands of Asia. Indeed, almost everywhere in the world, one or another American food crops caught on, complementing existing crops or more rarely replacing them. By the late 20th century, about 1/3 of the world food supply came from plants first cultivated in the Americas. The Europeans brought wheat, barley, and rye. They also brought Mediterranean plantations crops such as sugar, bananas, and citrus fruits, which all had originated in South or Southeast Asia. At first, many of these crops fared poorly, but eventually they all flourished. After 1640, sugar became the mainstay of the Caribbean and Brazilian economies, becoming the foundation for some of the largest slave societies ever known. The production of rice and cotton, both imported in the Columbia Exchange, together with tobacco, formed the basis of slave society in the United States. Wheat, which thrived in the temperate latitude of North and South America and in the island of Mexico, eventually became a fundamental food crop for tens of millions of people in the Americas. When it came to animals, however, the Native Americans borrowed eagerly from the Europeans. The Columbian Exchange brought horses, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and a collection of other useful species to the Americas. Before Columbus, Native American society in the high Andes and domesticated llamas, alpacas, dogs, turkeys, and guinea pigs. Of all the animals introduced by the Europeans, the horse had particular attraction. Native Americans first encountered it as a fearsome war beast ridden by Spanish conquistadors. However, they soon learned to ride and raise horses themselves. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats also proved popular in the Americans. Within 100 years after Columbus, huge herds of wild cattle roamed many of the natural grassland of the Americas. Wild cattle, and to a lesser degree, sheep and goats, menaced the food crops of Native Americans, notably in Mexico. Eventually, ranching economies emerged, based variously on cattle, goats, or sheep. The largest ranches emerged in the grassland of Venezuela and Argentina, on the broad sea of grass that stretched from northern Mexico to the Canadian prairies. Native Americans used the livestock for meat, tallow, hides, transportation, and hauling. Along with plants and animals, Europeans introduced their ideas, culture, and technology to the places they explored. People in Asia, Africa, and the Americans all learned new ways of living and working. Spread of geographical knowledge. Even though much of the travel during the age of exploration was done in an effort to find new trade routes, it did have a significant impact on geography. By traveling to different regions around the globe, explorers were able to learn more about areas like Africa and the Americas. In learning more about such places, explorers were able to bring knowledge of a larger world back to Europe. In addition to just learning about the presence of the land themselves, these explorations often brought various new species important to biography. Take 2. Important to biogeography and new cultures of people to light. For example, Captain Cook's voyages brought back a significant amount of information from previously unvisited parts of the world. Methods of navigation and mapping also improved as a result of the travels of people like Prince Henry the Navigator. Prior to his expeditions, navigators used traditional Patholan charts, which kept them tied to the shoreline. Among the many goals of his expeditions were to develop a new nautical chart so future sailors could sail out of sight of land. He did so, creating one of the first nautical maps. This would later be refined by explorers like Vasco da Gama, Columbus, and Canberra. The age of exploration served as a stepping stone for geographical knowledge. It allowed more people to see and study various areas around the world, which increased geographic study, giving us the basis for much of the knowledge we have today. Spread of European technology. The European exploration of the 15th to 17th century also introduced new technologies. They took guns and steel to parts of Africa. In the Americas, they introduced guns and steel as well as ways to use the wheel. Europeans also introduced the ideal of using animals as technology. They brought horses, which were good for transportation and for carrying heavy loads. Oxen could be used to plow fields. People also learned to make candles from cow fat. European ideas also changed industries in the Americas. For example, animals were used to carry silver from mines. The introduction of sheep and sugarcane also created new industries. People began to make new kinds of textiles and to grow sugarcane on plantations or large farms. Demographic impacts. A large stream of migrants developed moving from Europe, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands to the new colonies in Northern and Southern America. Unfavorable circumstances in the form of bad hygiene, lack of proper nutrition, climate, and disease all took their toll on the lives of the migrants, both while traveling to and while residing in the colonies. As a result, many more migrants were needed in order to be able to sustain the colonial organizational system and economy. Partly to satisfy this need, a second migration stream was set in motion by colonial powers, taking many slaves from Africa to America in order to perform manual labor in the colonies. The migration of Europeans to America also had effect within Europe as many people seeking work moved towards the harbor from where the transatlantic ships left. Also, the Europeans that left for America to earn more money than they did at home left behind jobs which were taken by laborers coming from poorer countries. Some colonial powers, England for instance, sent their dissidents to the colonies. This decision was successful from both a commercial and a religious standpoint. Yet, it led to a revolution against colonial rule. France, on the other hand, did not allow Huguenots, skillful sailors, and merchants to migrate to New France, and in doing so, hindered the economic development of the colonies. Study section summary. In this study section, you have learned that the expansion of Europe to other parts of the world had lasting legacies as it brought about the transfer overseas of European cultures, their languages, religion, principles of law and government, scientific knowledge and its applications to the needs of society, thus revolutionizing the course of the history of mankind. End of study section 11. Thanks for listening.